Have you ever been disappointed in God? Frustrated? Annoyed, perhaps even angry with a God who seemed to let you down? Who failed to come through as promised or expected or hoped for? You go to church every Sunday, you pray like mad, but still that loved one dies. The relationship falls apart. The healing never comes. Have you ever been disappointed in God? And if so, how did you handle it? How do you handle it? Preacher James Hewitt writes, many years ago, in an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, television mogul Ted Turner criticized Christianity and the church in some remarks made at a banquet where he was being given an award by the American Humanist Association for his work on behalf of the environment and world peace. When pressed to explain, Turner revealed that he had a strong Christian upbringing and at one time even considered becoming a missionary. However, he eventually became disenchanted with his faith after his sister died, despite his fervent prayers to the contrary. Since that time, Turner said, the further away I have gotten from God, the better I have felt. And Hewitt concludes, hearing Turner's comments, one can't help but wonder how much of his life, like so many others with similar experiences, has been and continues to be shaped by one event, this one disappointment. Such a successful life in so many ways, but this one issue which perhaps matters most of all, so obviously unresolved, painful, and failed. I think it's probably safe to say that we all have those moments, perhaps fleeting, perhaps pervasive, when we find all of this somewhat disappointing. God, faith, prayer, church, the whole bit. And obviously what we do with this, what we make of it, is central to the whole course of our lives. And so this is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. Those times when God is disappointing. Today in our continuing look at the story of Moses, our hero has finally accepted the call of God upon his life and he's returned to Egypt. Basically, we're now about to enter into the sort of like the real meat of the Exodus story. The people of Israel held in captivity to be set free, to come to live the lives of freedom of belief, of action, of governance that God intends for them, and by implication that God intends for all people everywhere. A story of lives set free, representing essentially the whole work of salvation, a release from captivity to sin and death that we might be free to live with one another and with our Creator as God intended. However, as we see, the opening scene of this freedom story does not go well. Moses and Aaron have gone to Pharaoh and demanded the people's release. Pharaoh, angered by the presumptuousness of this demand, has not only refused to let the people go, but even more, as a means of showing his displeasure and teaching the people a lesson about seeking to escape from his slavery, he has increased the burden upon them, and it all centers around this issue of gathering straw. One of the Israelites' primary jobs is to make the bricks for Pharaoh's building projects, and one of the components of the brick mixture is straw. It sort of binds the bricks together. Up to now, this straw has been provided to the Israelites, but now Pharaoh decrees the people must find their own straw while maintaining the same quota of bricks. Otherwise, they will be punished. They'll be beaten and starved. The Israelite leaders, as they leave Pharaoh's presence, having just received Pharaoh's confirmation of this devastating news, come upon Moses and Aaron, who are waiting to hear how the king has replied to their demands. And the leaders of the Israelites immediately unload all their frustration upon the two brothers, essentially saying, a lot of help you two, and your calling from God has been, all you've done is just make Pharaoh angry with us. Now we're going to suffer even more than we have been. You have added to our hardship, not decreased it. Thanks a lot. Of course, this isn't actually Moses' and Aaron's fault at all. The real cause of their hardship is, of course, Pharaoh. But in a classic example of how we all quite often in our lives take out our problems on people who are not the actual cause of our difficulty, but who just happen to be the nearest and the easiest to attack, so the people here take their frustration out on the wrong target. They take it out on Moses. It's kind of like when you've had a bad day and you come home and you snap at your spouse or your kids. They're easier, they're closer. Well, hearing the people's complaints, Moses does his own transfer of blame. He goes out and he unloads all his frustration on God. Basically, he just sort of slams God. He outright says, Lord, since I gotten back here to Egypt, you haven't done anything, right? Translation, Lord, you are useless. You're worse than useless, right? Now think about that for a moment. Isn't it great that this kind of real-life struggle of faith is right there in the Bible, And that should tell us something, that the Bible is a book about real life, The story of Exodus begins with profound disappointment. Disappointment in Moses, disappointment in Aaron, disappointment in the course of action that they have taken, disappointment in just the whole ways of this evil world, and most importantly of all, driving all of this, a fundamental disappointment in God. Now, we know that the story will eventually have a happy ending, but the players themselves at this point, they don't know this, right? All they know, all they can see and feel right now is this frustration. It's a deep disappointment in God. What do we learn from their struggles that can help us through similar times in our own lives? 3 thoughts for when you are disappointed in God. Thought number 1, sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. This, of course, is where the whole struggle here begins. Moses has returned to Egypt. God has stepped up to begin his active participation in helping the people. But this begins with things being made worse rather than better. Instead of freedom, they've gotten an increased workload. What gives? Right? Well, the point is, this is a basic fact of life. Quite often when we have major problems in our lives, things have to get worse before they can get better, Why? Well, first, it's often because we just don't realize how bad our actual problem is, right? I mean, let's face it, for most of us, when we encounter any problem in life, even a tiny problem, we make it into a great big deal, right? It's like I remember once years ago being told that I would have to have some minor surgery. And I remember thinking to myself as I was being told this, Doc, I don't know about you, but no matter what it is, if it's surgery being done to me and my body, it's major surgery, right? As the old saying goes, a minor problem is by definition any problem somebody else is having, right? For ourselves, everything's major, right? Thus, we tend to lose all our perspective. Minor is major, and then when we really have problems, we don't realize how big they really are. So before we can ever get better, we first need to find out that. We need to go there. A lot of times, we hit rock bottom. We think, this is as bad as things can get. And then we find out that rock bottom has a basement, right? Right? You ever been through that? Right? Well, that's just the necessary expression of the true nature of the depth of the particular trouble that we are facing. It's just a fact of life. But even more in this, the reason why things often have to get worse before they can get better is because before these really bad things can ever improve, can ever really turn around, we need to be taken to the point where we are truly desperate, right? Truly willing to do whatever it takes. No complaints, no excuses, to do whatever it takes to correct this. Receptive to whatever is being asked of us. Our part in the process, that we might be rescued, that we might have the situation begin to change. Human nature, being what it is, most often we don't get to that point until things get really bad, right? So we have to go there, right? That is, the first point here is that, as we're going to see throughout this story ahead, God is going to rescue the people, right? But they have a part to play in this rescue. There are things that they're going to have to do in order for it all to happen. Are they willing to do these things, right? Or are they just going to sit around demanding that God do it all and then complain when it doesn't happen? Notice how the Exodus begins with a new demand being asked of the people: gather straw. In a way, that's God saying to the people, we are in this thing called life together, right? There are things that I will do. There are things that you're going to have to do. Are you with me, right? So often we approach God's power in our lives one-dimensionally, in effect saying, God, fix this. I'm waiting, right? And God, in effect, saying in response here, no, come on, give me a break. This issue, your life is multidimensional. I am going to do my part, but you have a part to play as well. Are you doing your part, right? Have you ever heard the old story about the little girl who one day was very upset about a trap that her brother had made to catch birds? Being a bird lover herself and a firm believer in the power of prayer, she prayed and prayed that God would frustrate her brother's designs and that he would be unsuccessful in his plan to catch birds, right? She then shared this concern with her school teacher and told her how hard she had been praying and how much she trusted that her prayer would be answered. Well, one morning as the little girl came into class, her teacher noted her smiling, joyful, beaming face, and she said to the girl, "Sweetheart, you look so pleased. Are you still sure that your prayers will be answered, that God will stop your brother from trapping birds?" With a knowing smile, the little girl replied, "I know for sure my prayers will be answered because this morning I went out and kicked my brother's traps into pieces," right? You know? Are we doing our part in what we are requesting of God? You know, what's the old saying? God feeds the birds of the air, but he doesn't throw the food into their nests. Right? The experience of God's power is interactive. We have a part to play. Maybe your part is to pray. Maybe your part is to take your medicine. Maybe your part is to go to the doctor. Maybe your part is to be faithful at your physical therapy, even though it's really difficult and doesn't seem like anything's coming from it, right? Maybe your part, you're depressed. Maybe your part is just to get outside today and just stand in the sunshine for a little while. Maybe your part is to let yourself laugh at a joke. Actually, just laugh for a moment. Maybe to be the first one to make the move in fixing a broken relationship. Maybe to use your gifts in service to the Lord. Maybe to reach out beyond yourself to someone in greater need today. Whatever. Our part does not work the actual healing, but rather just puts us in the place where we can receive it. Are we playing our part? Thought number one, when you find yourself disappointed in God, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. Thought number two, oftentimes we just don't see what God is up to. Returning to the text, as we've seen previously in this study, God is well aware of the people's problems. He has heard their cries and he has seen their oppression. God has then gone to Moses, has gotten his attention through a burning bush, has called him to return and lead the people, argued with him at length over his reluctance, has cajoled, encouraged it, and then supplied him with whatever he needs. God has then gone to Aaron to go and to find his brother, the two then reuniting and returning to Egypt and fulfilling God's instruction to go and demand of Pharaoh, let my people go. In other words, God so far has been very active. But at this point, the people can't see this. Surprisingly, even Moses, it seems, can't seem to see this. Why? Well, part of it is because the real big, dramatic, recognizable steps in turning around their situation haven't occurred yet. As we have noted in the past, God generally works in steps and stages in our lives, and in little pieces put together over time, not often in instantaneous events. And this is because our problems, are multifaceted and require all sorts of various components to be brought into alignment for things to be right. Basically, it generally takes a long while for our problems to get there, so it's going to take a long while for them to get fixed, right? So this is part of why the people can't seem to see what God is active on their behalf. But even more within this, it's simply because the problem itself tends to naturally blind them and us to any good in our lives. It's human nature. No matter what else may be going on in your life, right? Our inherent self-defense and self-preservation mechanisms tend to kick in and make us focus solely on anything that may be going wrong with us, right? We focus on that, whatever may need correcting. It's natural. And we become lost within it. It's like in the text, just a couple of paragraphs after our reading this morning, Moses, having voiced his complaint to God, is told by God to go back and encourage the people to trust in God, that God is with them and will set them free. But we're told this: Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirits and their cruel slavery. God is present and active, but the people, they can't see it because of their hardship. And the point that the text wishes to make to the reader? That it's the same in all of our lives. Understand, when we have troubles, we are going to become so lost within them, so hard-pressed to believe and to see that God is there with us, active on our behalf. But like the people of Israel long before us, that doesn't mean God isn't present and active. The problem isn't with God, it's with us. We need to trust what we cannot see. As the Apostle Paul tells us, we walk by faith, not sight. Right? What's the famous poem that was written on the wall of a concentration camp by some unknown victim of the Holocaust? The poem reads, "I believe in the sun even when it doesn't shine. I believe in love even when it isn't shown. And I believe in God even when he doesn't speak." Seemingly about as God-forsaken, God-failed, God-disappointed as one could ever be, but rightly choosing to live by faith, not sight. Might we do the same? Oftentimes life is hard and it doesn't seem like God is doing anything, that maybe he's not even there. We can't see God's love, but that doesn't mean it's not there. We need to trust what we cannot see. It looks hard, but we need to trust, you know? Retired Episcopal Bishop William Frey, in his book, When Words Come to an End, tells the following true story. He writes, "When I was a younger man, I volunteered to read to a degree student named John, who was blind. One day I asked him, 'How did you lose your sight?' 'A chemical explosion at the age of 13, John said. 'How did that make you feel?' I asked. 'Life was over,' John responded. I felt hopeless. I hated God. For the first 6 months, I did nothing to improve my lot in life. I would eat all my meals alone in my room. One day, my father entered my room and said, 'John, winter's coming and the storm windows need to be put up. That's your job. I want those windows hung by the time I get back this evening, or else.' And then he turned and he walked out of the room. I got so angry. I thought, who does he think I am? I'm blind, right? I was so angry, I decided to do it. I felt my way to the garage. I found the windows. I located the necessary tools. I found the ladder, all the while muttering under my breath, 'I'll show him, I'll fall, then he'll have a blind and paralyzed son to take care of.' Right? You know? But oddly enough, even with all my complaining, I got the windows put up. I suddenly felt a sense of tremendous accomplishment that I hadn't felt in months. I wanted more. It eventually led me to where you find me today, back at school, having a great life. Oh, and I found out later that never at any moment was my father more than 4 or 5 feet away from my side the whole time." Thought number 2, when you find yourself disappointed in God, oftentimes we just can't see what God is up to. Which leads us into, finally, thought number 3. All the time, God's plan for our lives works out dramatically different than what we plan. In the end, in the text, the people are all bugged with what Moses and Aaron have done or failed to do. And Moses is bugged with what God has done or has failed to do. In all, everybody's essentially annoyed because what has occurred isn't exactly what they wanted, what they've been hoping for and planning on, right? God is active, but entirely in his own way, in a very different manner than anyone had expected. And there's the problem. God generally is only pleasing to us when he does what we want him to do, operates on our command, fulfilling our designs. But that's not who God is. That's not how things work. And the final lesson here is that recognizing this and embracing it is central to truly experiencing God's saving presence in our lives. You know? Understand, the story of the Exodus is going to go very, very differently than anybody planned. But in the end, it will be far better than anyone expected. It will eventually lead to the salvation in Jesus Christ, which we all know, you know. And the person who grasps this lives. The final lesson in the story of disappointment in God. God is active in our lives, most especially at work, to help us in the struggles and hardships in our lives, but invariably in a way very different than we expect. God doesn't do things the way we would. God has God's own ways, but always working to a far greater blessing than we had ever imagined or even sought. The trick is, as best we can, to just let this happen, to accept it, and instead of constantly looking only for what we have in mind, to look most especially within our disappointment struggles for the very different thing that's occurring, deeper, broader blessing and rescue that God may be up to. In closing, consider the following true story. John and Denise Knight were happily anticipating the birth of their first child, a son, and they had already decided to name him Paul. But when Paul was born, there was a big problem. Paul was born without eyes, and John and Denise would later discover that their son had other serious issues, including severe autism and a growth hormone deficiency. 2 months after Paul's birth, as John was looking at his son, hooked up to all tubes and sensors and surrounded by medical professionals, he quietly told God, "God, you are strong, that's true, but you are wicked, you are mean. Do this to me, not to the boy. What did he ever do to you?" Shortly after that prayer, John and Denise quit going to church, and they quit on God. But one couple from their church refused to give up on them. Carl and Geraldine Thomas never pressured John and Denise about spiritual issues. Instead, they would often stop by and leave simple gifts, like a loaf of fresh bread or a basket of soap and shampoo for Denise. John said that it was like Carl and Geraldine were saying, "I notice you, I see you, I know that you're hurting, and I love you." Eventually, John and Denise accepted a dinner invitation from Carl and Geraldine, And during dinner, John told Carl, "You can believe whatever you want. I don't care. I have evidence that God is cruel." And Carl softly replied, "I love you, John. I have regard for you, and I love your boy." Carl and Geraldine's 4 children also displayed unconditional love for their son Paul. John described it this way: "They'd pick up my son and toss him up in the air and make him laugh and do funny bird sounds, and that was confounding, because most adults wouldn't do that. And so I would have this extraordinary expression of love and affection at the dinner table here, and I would turn to my left or my right, and there would be at least one of their children playing with my son like he was a real boy, and I myself wasn't even sure he was a real boy at times." Based on this family's quiet, persistent love, John and Denise finally returned to the Lord and to their local church. And when they returned, Carl and Geraldine stayed by their side, making sure that their son made it to the nursery. And John would later say, "They persisted. They reached out and did what no one else would do, and what I myself couldn't even do. They simply loved my son, and through him me. They, with the help of God, saved my family, my son, my life. God didn't answer any of my prayers the way I wanted them. God answered them far better." We all face times of deep disappointment with God himself. Whenever such moments come upon you, remember, sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. Oftentimes, we just don't see what God is up to. And all the time, God's plans for our lives is dramatically different and better than our plan. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 368, "My Hope is Built." Would you please stand?